Well, I hadn't been a great Agatha Christie fan, I have to say. And my wife and I had made a film called Tales of Beatrix Potter, which was a ballet film about the Beatrix Potter stories. And everybody had said, it's never going to make a film. It's a completely ridiculous idea to make a film about dancing mice and things like that. But in spite of that and a great deal of difficulty, we did actually make it. And it was a considerable success in its own terms. In those days when you went to Moscow, where we were for this festival with the film, because my wife couldn't come because she was pregnant, in those days it was obligatory to go to the mausoleum of Lenin. And there was a huge queue of people to go in. And Daisy, at the age of 10, decided that she just wasn't going to queue for anybody, Lenin or anybody else. So she went and sat on the steps of this mausoleum, right at the feet of this enormous guard with at least 3-foot bayonet on his thing. And she was reading this book. And I was in the queue, and our guide, who was a very clever woman who was an expert on Nabokov and so on and so forth, she said, "What book's Daisy reading?" And I said, "Well, I didn't know." She said, "Well, it's a jolly good book because she's reading it, every single word of it." So I didn't say anything, and the day finished, and I asked her in the evening what book it was, and she said, "Well, it's Murder on the Orient Express." So I picked it up when she'd finished with it and read it on the plane back to England. And I said, "Well, you know, we really ought to make a film of this because it's not going to cost much. It's all in a train, stationary, in a snowdrift, and it'd make a jolly good film." She said, "Oh, you made Tales of Beatrix Potter. I like that because you'd stuck to what Beatrix Potter had in mind." Yes, okay, you can have the rights. She hadn't liked when she'd sold the rights of, I don't know, the ABC Murders to MGM. She hated that because it was made into a comedy, and that didn't work at all. So we took it all fairly seriously. And John and I had produced a film of Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, which had started out as a very small black and white film and then finished up being in colour and costing more than that. But it still only cost about $3.5 million, which by today's standards is completely ridiculous. But it was an enormous success. I mean, really huge. And Charlie Bluedorn, who'd bought Paramount, had just sort of come into being head of the company, and said, so we were in New York because Beatrix Potter had been a success, and EMI had sold the rights to MGM, who were then run by a new gang of people who really didn't know what to do with a ballet film about British hedgehogs. And so they put it out with a film called Shaft, which was a sort of black crime picture. And of course it did terribly badly, but that wasn't the point really. The point was that we were in New York to talk about this deal. And Charlie Bluedorn said, "Well, what are you doing now, boys?" And we said, "Well, we wanted to make this film about the Orient Express." And he said, "Oh, the Orient Express." He said, "I remember that. When I was a waiter on Vienna Station, I remember it coming through and how glamorous it was and everything." And I said, "Well, that's what we want to make." And he said, "Well, if you make it glamorous like that, it's fine. Go ahead." And he was powerful enough in those days to do that. So that's how we got the finance. You asked me who wrote the script for Orient Express. Well, it was quite an interesting choice, but a very, very good one. A man called Paul Dane, who was a writer on the Beaverbrook Daily Express, and he was a really, really clever writer, and I think he wrote a really marvelous script of it. But it's quite convoluted, the actual book, so it was clever to sort of get it all together. Sidney Lumet was on the top of our list of directors, and I do remember there was a certain amount of how can I say, antipathy to the idea from his very powerful Hollywood agent called Sue Mengers, and she always called the film Sidney's dumb train movie. She wasn't pleased about it at all. But he was determined. I don't know what reason. He refused to go to Hollywood, Sidney. He hated Hollywood. And so he was very happy to sort of get off the hook and come and make a film in England or wherever. And that's how it happened. We persuaded him, and he wanted to come, and his agent didn't, but he won, so he came. Sidney had been a child actor, which is very important because he really, really knew about actors, and he knew exactly how they functioned and everything else. And one of the things he realized very, very early on was that you couldn't have every single one of these stars coming up and asking about the motivation of their parts. And so we had a rehearsal period before we started the film. And the first thing he said was to them all, "You're all stars. You do what you think your character ought to do. I'm not going to answer any questions at all. We're just going to do it." And that worked wonders. They all had their own version of everything, and it was just fantastic. Especially Ingrid Bergman, who, at the age of 62 when she did the film, she was still so attractive and so sexy. It was quite unbelievable. Really amazing. We had an actor who wanted to get out of being an actor on Romeo and Juliet, who was head of the Capulets, and a man called Dyson Lovell, who we worked with for many years afterwards. And he had the idea that since this was all about stars, and there were an awful lot at that period, sort of over-the-hill stars, if you know what I mean. They'd all been ex-studio stars and this and that. There were some young ones, of course, but there were some old ones. And we had a very simple rule of thumb that everybody would get paid $100,000. There were no exceptions except for Sean Connery and Albert Finney. And everybody else got the same, and it worked a charm. It was like a children's tea party after that. It was wonderful.
Ah, for the pen of a Balzac. For 3 days, all these people, these total strangers, meet in a single train whose engine controls their destiny.
Oh, yes, I know. We are both envious of the husband, eh?
Is the husband as British as his tweeds?
Oh, heaven forbid. He's a hot-blooded Hungarian. If you but look at his wife, he would cease to be a diplomat.
Thank God we are not young.
To recreate the train in the studio was required quite a lot of research. We went to the Wagon-Lit company in Paris, and we found that by some miracle, they were just about to break up the last original sleeping car with all the paneling and everything else. In Belgium, and it was very interesting because when I got there, I talked to this amazing man who was doing it, and he really sort of broke his heart to break it all up, but he did do it for us, and he knew where everything went and how it all fitted together, and so he came over to England to put it all together again. But what was very interesting was that these trains were made in Leeds in England, and they went, all the way down to Istanbul and back again, and all that sort of thing. And they were all made in England. And to get them to the continent, they had to put them on bogies, but put the whole structure of the sleeping car, all the cabins and the beds and all the beautiful plumbing and everything, just slightly off-centre, so that they had to do it in the middle of the night. They had to go from Leeds to Felixstowe, where they took them. So they would, because another train coming the other way would have ripped the side off. So they were all not quite central. But that's how I always thought it was rather interesting that this sort of glamorous train came from England.
Oh, good to see you.
You have saved me from apoplexy. Sit down.
Thank you. Oh, you've not dined well, eh?
No. The skewers are of better quality than the kebab. The bottle is more distinguished than its wine. And the cafe.
Albert Finney played Poirot. Well, he was tremendously keen on research. He researched the whole business of his history, Poirot, and how he'd been wounded in the shoulder. That's why he always walked with a slightly sort of broken shoulder look. And he did all this business of his moustaches and his moustache cups at night and all that business, all very, very well researched. And he's an incredible actor, Albert. He was really very, very good and kept in period exactly. As you remember, the train is stuck in a snowdrift for most of the picture. And we chose our place at a place called Pontarlier near the Swiss border, and we thought there's bound to be snow here. There's always snow here at this time of the year and everything else. We got there, it was complete brown grass, nothing else, absolutely no snow at all. And I was getting more and more in panic, and 2 days before I ordered 30 lorries full of snow to come down from the Alps so that we could make it look right on the night. And I said to Sydney, you know, I'm terribly worried about this. We've got the snow on standby, but I'm afraid it's not going to look like real snow. He said, don't worry, I've had a word with the Almighty, and it's all going to be all right. So I said, well, if that's the case, let's hope for the best. And sure enough, that night, it snowed so hard that all the trucks got stuck coming down full of snow from the thing. That was a huge expense. But the train was seriously blocked, and that was done just by the hand of God. We had nothing to do with that. But it worked well. So the first days of shooting, we already had that drama behind us. And so when we went to the Plan de Saint-Denis outside Paris, at the north of Paris, we constructed what we made up to be the Istanbul station. And then we had all these stars sashaying down the platform, and we did those scenes first. But in order to have all the food and oysters and sides of beef and vegetables and all that sort of stuff to be seen to be loaded on the trains, the prop department has decided to store it in the one of the goods wagons that were on the next door platform to our train. And so we all went on filming and took no notice. And when we went along in the middle of the night to open the door to get all the food out to start doing, it was nothing there. It had all been stolen. Somebody had come in the other side of the train and taken the stuff away. And so I remember having to go down to Les Halles, which was the market in the centre of Paris, with a huge bundle of money and just buying up all this stuff again. Anyway, that's one of the things that happen in movies, you know, they do all the time.
Forgive me, Miss Debenham, I must be brief. You met Colonel Arbuthnot and fell in love with each other in Baghdad. Why must the English conceal even their most impeccable emotions?
To answer your observations in order, of course. Yes. Yes. And I don't know.
In those days, dear Vanessa Redgrave was going through her radical period, and she did spend her lunchtimes haranguing the people, the workers in the workers' canteen, as it were, telling them how wrong everything was and so on and so forth. And I must say that the workers tended to whisper to me that they'd rather be left alone in peace. Meanwhile, the rest of the actors all had lunch with John Gielgud, who was the best storyteller you can possibly imagine, and he would regale them with his adventures in show business. And they were all sitting there rapt, and I'm afraid poor Vanessa didn't really get a look in. But it was sweet. The whole thing was sweet. It was nice, and people were quite kind. I mean, I found that talking to people like Richard Widmark was quite terrifying, but actually he was a terribly nice man, and he was quite happy to talk about anything. And you imagine him to be terribly frightening, but he's not at all, or he wasn't in those days. Betty Bacall was Betty Bacall. She was always like that. I think someone had told her to play it tough in life, and then she just did. But she was actually a very nice person. Yeah, well, with Sidney Lumet, you couldn't do anything else. It went absolutely amazing. We shot the whole thing in 42 days, and that was done. There was no messing about. It was very good. She was in a wheelchair by that time, but she came out of the theatre smiling away. I think Agatha Christie liked the film very much, and I think she especially liked the returns. Paramount in America were absolutely sure it was old-fashioned and no use at all. And they decided that it had such a slim chance of its success that they opened it on a Sunday in New York in a small theatre called the Baronet, and it was opening at I think 10 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. Well, I mean, you don't expect many people to be up and around then. But I was staying at the Pierre Hotel, and it was just around the corner. So I walked around just after breakfast, and there was this huge queue, absolutely enormous queue. So I went to see the manager, who was absolutely ashen-faced. He had no idea there was going to be so many people. He had no cashiers, enough cashiers or anything on, and it was terrible. But John Braben really came up trumps, because he had a habit, which I always thought was wonderful for sort of really people who are always moving in high circles. When soon as he met anybody, he always got their home number. He always asked them to write their home number down. And in this case, he'd asked Charlie Bluedorn to write his home number down, and he rang him up, and Charlie Bluedorn got all these people from Paramount who hadn't liked the film down there within an hour. He was so cross with them. But it was too late to do anything really, because the distribution pattern was set. That's why it never did quite as well in America as it might have done. But it did very well in the rest of the world.